Welcome, everyone. Good to see a lot of familiar faces. Hope everyone's doing well.
Howdy.
So tonight's seminar is going to be it's going to be a little bit of a test for us. I am not in Lancaster. I'm on our vacation, and the internet that I have is not real strong. So Sheila is going to be running the slideshow, but if I disappear, it's not that I don't like you or that anybody said anything offensive. It's that my internet probably went out. So hopefully we'll make it through. I hope everyone's having a good summer. We'll just give it another minute or two and we'll get started. Good to see you, Liz. I didn't think you could make it tonight.
I've had a lot of problems. It's like starting one of those old Model T cars. I had to crank it up, and I got my phone. I try to use my phone. Anyhow, you're going to see my face trying to get in my phone, and I can't figure out how to shut that one off. So,
Sheila, do you want to go ahead and start sharing your screen and we'll get started?
Sure. Hopefully you can see the first slide.
Yeah, it's coming through perfect.
Okay, great. You're on, Dwight.
All right, thanks, Sheila. Well, welcome everyone. I think this is our 9th seminar, and we are this evening going to be looking at voting rights, HR 1, and the history of the filibuster, which has been in the news recently, and we felt like it's such an important topic as it relates to our democracy, and voting rights are directly connected and tied to the history of discrimination in this country. And needless to say, the struggle continues, right? It's really shocking to see the past play itself out in front of us in real time, but that's apparently what's happening. So yeah, let's go to the next slide. And Reverend Bailey, I'll let you start us off with some introductions.
Yes, well, Reverend Edward Bailey, pastor of Bethel African Methodist Episcopal Church, and very much interested in talking about the racial problems in America that continue to stay with us. And it seems like most people only come at it with a hobby and try to do something, but it's really something that we need to do as a full-time job and work at it and make it happen. So I didn't know if you wanted me to say all that, but that's where I'm at.
And Sheila, you want to get next?
Sure. My name's Sheila O'Rourke. I'm an attorney at Gibbel Kraybill Hess. We've been partnering with Bethel AME now for a number of years on this seminar series, and been really happy to have been part of it from the start. For me, I'm also working at this with the YWCA of Lancaster, whose mission is eliminating racism and empowering women. So seeing some work being done in our region, and again, just humbled to be part of it.
My name is Dwight Yoder. I am an attorney at Gibbel Kraybill Hess, and it's just been my pleasure to have gotten to know Reverend Bailey and Dr. Brown, who unfortunately can't be with us this evening, through the last few years. And it's, as many of you know from prior seminars, it's been quite a journey for me personally, as I have dug into the history of our country and understood the history of slavery and discrimination and how that connects to today and so many of the issues that we face related to racial justice. It's been sobering, but certainly the friendship I've developed with Reverend Bailey and others at Bethel AME has been extremely meaningful and helpful, and I value that greatly. And it's great to have so much interest. Frankly, you know, we started this before George Floyd's murder, and then that happened last summer, if you can believe it. It's been a year. And to still see 40 or 50 people in the heart of the summer during vacation season sign up for a seminar is just really encouraging. So I want to thank each one of you for participating and taking the time to listen and ask questions and stretch ourselves as we kind of go on this journey together. Reverend Bailey, you want to talk a little bit about the importance of what we're doing here?
Yeah, I think too often what people want to do, especially people who have done wrong, they always want to move on. So no matter whenever you get ready to address the wrong that's been done, they continue to say, let's move on. Let's just forget about the past and move on. And this word Sankofa means that we can't move on. You have to go back and get whatever it is and make sure you have it present so you can start over again. You can figure out what worked and what did not work. And part of what we're trying to do with these sessions is to help people who may think things have already been taken care of, you know, and that civil rights, that the work people have done, that's did it all, but it's just not true. And so we keep coming back again because everybody wants to move on and nobody wants to look back and say what worked and what did not work and what do we need to continue to make sure that things are where they should be, especially around equal justice. And that's what that word Sankofa means. Go back and get it. Whatever the idea was, and we all agree that America was an ideal, an experiment. We believe that. So go back and get it. And people are trying to take us some other places. If it wasn't a true experiment, it wasn't a true dream that we were trying to work on and work out. So we as Americans have to go back and get whatever it was that people were talking about, even those who did not live up to the ideals of what they were talking about. We need to find out, what did they say and what were they really talking about? Even if they didn't intend it for all people, didn't intend it for women, there was an idea that people had when they came together and to develop America. And people have been fighting for that idea down through the centuries. So let's go back and get it and then begin talking about what we need to do in our generation.
You know, Reverend Bailey, I just want to add one thing, because when we started the seminar series, I thought this would be a fairly non-controversial idea. Look at the history of the country. Understand the facts of how the country was founded, that the founders enslaved Africans, that Black people couldn't vote, that women couldn't vote. Yet we have seen in the last 6 to 9 months an attempt to keep people from teaching the history of this country. It is shocking for me to see this debate under this term of critical race theory. So this notion of go back and get it threatens the white power structure, and you are seeing the response. And I never in my wildest dreams thought there would be school boards telling their teachers or state legislative bodies passing laws prohibiting the teaching of the history of this country. It's shocking, frankly. And I think it just highlights the importance of the work we're doing, because nobody's going to tell us to stop, because we're not gonna. It really, really upsets me when I see this. Sorry, I went to our local school board meeting and was shocked by the comments I heard about critical race theory. And it's just, you know, we need to stand up and say that's wrong, that we need to let people know, we need to let high school students, we need to let younger students know the history of this country. It's a blatant attempt to whitewash where we came from, and each one of us can make a difference.
And Dwight, part of what you're saying is so true. And it's not the racist that's the problem. And that's why we're going back. It's not the racist. It's the good people who have not stood up for what they should stand up for in this country, who have been silent and let the people with the loudest mouths keep on trying to take us back to enslavement and to where people didn't have certain rights, and voting rights is what's on the table now. But it's the good people, the friends, the people who say, I like you, who don't say anything about what's going on. And it's not only happening in the South, it's happening in Pennsylvania. And it's amazing that Pennsylvanians are quiet, are letting it happen and not saying anything against it. Pennsylvanians ought to be shouted. Doesn't matter whether you're a Republican or a Democrat. That's not it shouldn't be a political statement saying that we want people to have the right to vote in America. That should not be political. But people are letting it because for whatever their reasons, you know, and some of it I think is because there's a fear that people keep playing on in America, especially white Americans, that somehow Black folk are going to rise up, take over the country. Somehow you're not going to be able to, you're going to be sitting in the back of the bus, they're going to be sitting in the front. Just silliness. And rather than checking the history, if you check the history, that's never been what we've done as a Black people. Didn't mean to preach.
All right, I'll move us to the next slide.
Okay.
This is just a reminder that we're going to have a small group session on August 25th. Hannah, if you have the dates for the other seminars that are coming up, maybe you could quickly share those.
I do. Oops. So it looks like we have August 25th, it's a small group discussion. September 29th is policing, a large group conversation. Then October 20th is another small group regarding the policing discussion. November 17th is Black Wall Street, and then following up to that and rounding out the year is December 15th, which will be a small group discussion regarding the Black Wall Street presentation.
Yeah, so everybody put it on your calendar, tell your friends, spread the word. I think they're going to be two great topics that we're going to be talking about. All right, Sheila, we can move forward.
I don't know where the sound went on this, but if you notice, the Betty and them, these are elected officials of the United States House of Representatives who are being arrested because they're asking for the voting rights bill to be passed. And we can't trust the states anymore because the states are doing divisive things, and these folk got arrested. I'm telling you, these are elected officials. What really got me about this was that on January 6th, you had all those thousands of people who went into the White House, into the Capitol building, some planning on hanging the vice president and killing people. if they would have got an opportunity to do that. They hurt policemen, did everything. And people try to equate that with the Black Lives Matter and the other protest marching. This was done at the Capitol of the United States, where people went in under the directions of a so-called leader of the United States. And we have representatives, elected officials, who took an oath to protect this country, protect the Constitution, are lying and lying in this state and other states about the election that was held in 2020. And yet when these folk came and marched in the Senate halls saying that we need to pass the Voting Rights Act, they got arrested immediately. Yet out of those thousands of people who went on January 6th, they barely got 500 people who they arrested, which is amazing to me. The people who got hurt mostly were police officers and things like that. And so it just tells you the dual actions that are in America. The representatives and people who are elected to Congress cannot protest in the Senate halls without getting arrested. But other folk can go on January 6th, and it takes months and months and months to arrest them. The last thing I said, the Lancaster newspaper told the FBI where there was a guy at, and they did nothing about it until today or yesterday. That's just amazing that the brother just gets arrested. And so that tells you what we're battling against. And it's a good fight. It's what the brother said is good trouble. Fighting for justice is good trouble.
All right, so we're going to do just a quick review. For those of you who have been part of our prior seminars, some of this may sound familiar, but voting in our country's founding, if you can go to the next slide, Sheila. As you know, the Declaration of Independence was the document that essentially told Great Britain that we no longer wanted to be under their rule and that we were declaring our independence. And Thomas Jefferson wrote these words that we've all heard so many times. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights, and among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. How many times have we heard that as what this country stands for? Now, if you look at the right side of this slide, you will see an advertisement that Thomas Jefferson, the same Thomas Jefferson, put in to try and recapture one of the enslaved Africans that he held at Monticello, where he had at times over 200 enslaved Africans, which he never freed, and he passed down through his estate. So the reality of it, as we think about voting, is that this country was never founded on a principle that every person has the same rights. In fact, if you look at the history of this country, it was white landowning men that had the right to vote and that had the power. And it was designed that way. So while the Declaration of Independence is a great sounding document, that is not what this country was founded on. Go to the next slide, please, Sheila. So after the Declaration of Independence, there was, of course, the Revolutionary War, and the 13 colonies were governed under what was called the Articles of Confederation. And it was a loose document that basically did not give any type of control to the federal government. Didn't allow the federal government to raise taxes, didn't allow the federal government to have a standing army, didn't have really any control over the states. And it was quickly apparent that this system would never work. So there was a constitutional convention called in 1787 by proponents, James Madison, George Washington, Alexander Hamilton, proponents of a federal government. and they needed to draft a new constitution to replace the Articles of Confederation. And these, what we refer to as Federalists, came together in Philadelphia, and representatives from all 13 colonies joined them. And there were a number of what we call anti-federalists. These were folks that didn't want a strong national government. They didn't want to put control back into a centralized government because we just went through a Revolutionary War and tried to get away from Great Britain. These were folks like Thomas Jefferson, Patrick Henry. They were anti-federalists. So at this convention, you see these different interests coming together. And one of the biggest interests that was represented was slaveholders, because in the South, the economy was based upon having free labor through the owning of slaves. And the system of slavery was fully embedded in the colonies and was critical to what was going on at that time, the economics and the land ownership. So as this new constitution was written, there were all of these compromises that were made because there had to be enough of the colonies to vote for it, states at this point, in order to adopt it. And at the end of the day, there were multiple compromises to secure the votes of Southern states, and those compromises were basically to ingrain in the Constitution a protection of the system of slavery that the country had at that time. Now, when we look at voting, you can look to the Constitution and you won't find anything. So if you go to the next slide, Sheila. Interestingly, the United States Constitution, the right to vote, the fundamental right to vote, is not found in our Constitution or the Bill of Rights. The Bill of Rights are the first 10 amendments that were adopted after the Constitution was ratified. And it was essentially a deal that was struck between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists to get the Constitution adopted. That document did not have a guarantee that people could vote. So voting was a privilege, not a right. Only white men with property were allowed to vote. And the Constitution grants states the right to administer federal elections, subject to some federal oversight. Again, this was part of this sausage that was made called our Constitution that involved all of these compromises and deals. And all of these provisions had to be put in order to secure the votes of slaveholding states. Of course, we've talked about the 3/5 compromise. Enslaved African Americans were considered property and had no rights at all, but they were considered 3/5 of a person when determining the representation for House members. That's a big deal because House members are apportioned among the states based on the population of the state. So Southern states had a high population, but much of that population were enslaved Africans. They weren't citizens, so they wouldn't have counted, but this provision allowed them to count. So that's just a kind of a quick run through of the Constitution. We're going to go to the next slide, Sheila. So this is the actual section in the Constitution that deals with elections. And understand the way our country is set up, there are two governments. There are state governments, and then there's the federal government. And for state election of state officials, of course, state governments decide how that happens. But the federal Constitution, the United States Constitution, oddly says that the times, place, and manner of holding elections for senators and representatives shall be prescribed in each state by the legislature thereof. But, and here's the key, but the Congress may at any time by law make or alter such regulations except as to the places of choosing senators. That last provision is critical, and that is what we're going to be talking about. So the Constitution's default is that each state gets to come up with its own rules for running elections for federal officers. Again, that doesn't make much sense to me why you wouldn't have a standard set of rules, but it's built into our Constitution. But the Constitution gives the Congress the authority to set those rules. So, not to get too far ahead of us, but you can all of a sudden see why things like rules in the Senate and the filibuster become really important, because if certain constituents can stop Congress from setting the rules, it defaults to the states. We can go to the next slide then. And I think, Sheila, this is you on Reconstruction.
Sure. So Dwight just covered a lot of history around our founding and the drafting of our Constitution, which of course is all against the backdrop of enslavement. So we've covered 250 years of enslavement in our country. The Civil War occurs in the early 1860s, and following at the tail end of the Civil War and following the Civil War, we have a period in our country's history called Reconstruction, which is 14 or 15 years of immense progress that benefits everyone. It is a time where ideas around public education is introduced, where social welfare is at the forefront. It benefits Black people and it benefits white people. And we see a lot of participation in government by Black folks. And so what we want to talk about here is voting. And so this is when Black people obtain the right to vote. And it's also when we have another 3 very important amendments to our Constitution. Oop, I guess I'm skipping ahead. So the concept of Reconstruction is, the idea is that it is reintroducing the Confederate States back into the country. And in order to be able to come back in, they need to agree to do a number of things. They need to adopt new constitutions that are inclusive. And they also are required to ratify the Reconstruction Amendments. And those amendments are the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. And just to review, the way that an amendment is actually ratified requires 2/3 of both houses of Congress, as well as 3/4 of the states. So there had to be a pretty big stick and carrot, or stick really, in order for the formerly Confederate states to ratify these amendments. The 13th Amendment abolishes slavery. The 14th Amendment has a number of rights that apply, individual rights, giving birthright citizenship, privileges and immunities to the citizens of every state, due process and equal protection. But importantly, there is also a qualification in the 14th Amendment that participation and the franchise can be denied if you participate in a rebellion or other crime. So this is a big loophole for people who may disagree with their government and are perceived to rebel against the government. The 15th Amendment is then passed in 1869, and it prohibits denying the right to vote based on race. And so this will be important, and we'll continue to talk about that, what it actually means to deny the vote based on race. And you'll see that unless it is completely direct, egregious denial that is directly related to the color of someone's skin, that states find all kinds of creative ways to suppress and deny the vote to Black voters.
But one of the other problems too was when Johnson got elected and he had he compromised. He pulled the federal troops out of the South, and the lies that we've been told about Reconstruction in our school book is just a shame, because it was a very creative time when America could have lived up to the dream. And it was what we've been taught in school has been totally mistaught. And part of the problem, the reason why this thing keeps on going, this voting thing, is because it goes way back to the Bacon Rebellion and the other rebellions when white indentured servants and black enslaved rebelled together. And so what has happened in America, which always happens, is to keep poor whites and poor blacks from ever joining forces together. Even in the South, that's been done. So that was the thing. And none of those states should have been allowed to come into the United States again, because many of them did not recognize the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. I forget when Mississippi just did, I think it was in the 1990s. So that tells you, and yet they were they were allowed back into the United States. And because people have not held up to what they've said and should happen. Sorry, Sheila.
Oh, no, I appreciate it. Over to you, Dwight.
Okay, thanks, Sheila. And thanks, Reverend Bailey. That was a good lead into what happened after Reconstruction, particularly as we focus on voting. So remember, Reconstruction ends, and the federal troops, which were in the South and were overseeing Reconstruction, get pulled out, allowing the states now free reign, and they moved quickly to reestablish white control, even in a more vicious and violent manner than existed when slavery was legal. If you can go to the next slide, Sheila. So we think about, we sometimes refer to as the Jim Crow era, but when you look at kind of the key events that occurred after Reconstruction, as Sheila mentioned, part of Reconstruction required the states to adopt new constitutions that gave rights and privileges to freed, enslaved people. And what states began to do is they began to amend their state constitutions, and Mississippi did this. And while they knew that they couldn't say Black people were not allowed to vote because of the 15th Amendment, they decided to amend their constitutions and pass laws that didn't base it on the race, but had the same effect. So they put in place different types of measures that made it impossible for newly freed Blacks to participate and vote. Some of these were literacy tests, some of these were poll taxes. Much of it involved violence. So if a Black person went to vote and the white citizen council would find out, they would go and potentially harm the family members or that individual. And there were economic consequences. So it was not just, go ahead, Reverend Bailey.
This is when lynching really took off. This is what lynching became a fact in America. It was really when Black folk became free. Lynching was used to frighten them mainly from voting, and then it led into everything else. But this is a large period, this period after the Reconstruction, when lynching just took off. And we don't know how many Black people were lynched from the South to the North. We don't know, because so often Northerners act like it didn't happen in the North. Lynching did happen in the North. As a matter of fact, I've been told it happened in, was it Columbia, not Columbia, Coatesville was the last one in Pennsylvania. So the lynching was what really frightened people. And the last thing I'll say on that, see, these things look like they're harmless. Well, why shouldn't people take a test to vote? It's just like, why shouldn't people have an identification card? It just seems harmless. But when people are putting this thing together, the reason why they put it together is to keep the good white people from getting riled up. So it seems like so harmless. Well, what are you doing? Why couldn't you, why can't you get up and go out and vote in another area? Why should you make it so hard? Why so hard about that if you really want to vote? And it just seems like it's nothing. So people, their hackles don't get raised. And so these things go into effect like they're trying to put into effect in Pennsylvania and across the United States.
And I think as we, fast forward eventually to what we're seeing today, there's a direct connection back to this period following Reconstruction, which basically was an attempt to suppress the Black vote by saying we're not suppressing the Black vote, right? So for example, grandfather clauses, what did that refer to? That was the clause that said, if your grandfather voted, you did not have to take a literacy test. Well, since African Americans were just granted the right to vote, there would not be one African American whose grandfather could vote.
But
So
that's not true, Dwight. That's not true. Our white grandfather should have allowed us to be able to vote. But the
that's true.
White male was not recognized as the parent of the child, only the mother. So
That's a good
enslavement went
point.
through the mother. So if they had taken our grandfather, we'd have been able to vote.
Yeah. So that's just an example of how these voter laws passed by the state were set up that appeared neutral on the face, but clearly were designed to impact or prohibit, in this case, the Black vote. And they were very effective. So after Reconstruction, when you had mass participation, Ulysses Grant was elected on the votes of Blacks. And it dropped off, like it went off a cliff in terms of the participation. And why? Because the states were allowed to adopt all of these very restrictive voting regulations and couple that with violence and threats and intimidation, and Black people were denied the franchise essentially until the Voting Rights Act, which we'll talk about. So we can go to the next slide, and I think Reverend Bailey, you're going to talk about this one.
Yeah, this was this would have been the literacy test that I couldn't pass today. So, and most of us could not pass. It would have been given to folk. You have to remember, many of the African Americans, when they came out of enslavement, did not even know how to read and write. Like most Americans did not know how to read and write in that period. So you would get a test like this, and if you could not pass the test, you weren't allowed to vote. It's like somebody said in a story. They said that a brother went to go vote, and they asked him about the what's that ship that went down, the big ship? I'm trying to think.
Titanic?
Of it. The Titanic went down. So they said to the brother, okay, how many people were on the ship? And he gave the number of people on the ship. He said, okay, now name them. I mean, these are the way these tests were taken, where people, they knew nobody would be able to pass the test. And even if you passed it, the violence that would be coming to your front door would keep you from going to vote. And people still went out to vote. People still went out to vote, knowing they would be lynched, knowing their house would be burnt down, and knew that things would happen. Their churches would burn down. African-American churches are the #1 churches that have been burned in America. And it's mainly because of the forefront, being on the forefront of fighting for freedom, not just for African Americans, but when we get freedom, everybody gets freedom. You know, civil rights movement, when it happened, more white women got jobs than Black people, and people forget that. So this is what this test is about. I hope that covers it for you.
Thank you, Reverend Bailey.
So we've just covered the history between Reconstruction, where by violence and by state legislation, the Black vote is suppressed. And finally, in 1965, we have the Voting Rights Act, which has been called the most effective piece of legislation ever passed by Congress. And it affects a huge shift in the way violations of people's right to vote are addressed. So up until the Voting Rights Act, the only way to get justice if you were denied your right to vote is for the damage already to have been done. Your right to vote had to have been violated, and then you need to have the resources to be able to bring a lawsuit in the aftermath of the violation that's already occurred, to try to remedy that violation. So the Voting Rights Act completely flips it, and it basically brings federal oversight to states' rules around voting. The last time we saw this was Reconstruction, where we had all of this great period of progress and moving towards equity. So the key parts of the Voting Rights Act that made it so effective was that it examined what was happening in the different states and actually also in individual counties. So it dug down to see what places have a history of racial discrimination. And so they were looking at two things. They were looking at the sort of tests and roadblocks that these different jurisdictions were administering, the literacy test, the poll taxes, things like that. And then they were also looking for the effect, the low Black voter turnout. And so once those different jurisdictions had been identified, those jurisdictions were required to run up the flagpole to have pre-clearance of any sort of changes that they were contemplating making to their election laws before they made them. So this was a sea change in the treatment of voting rights, and it was effective immediately. So the Voting Rights Act was passed in 1965, and just by way of a couple of examples here, in Mississippi, Black voters registered in the state, 7% of Black voters were registered in 1964. It changed to 67% just 4 years after the Voting Rights Act was passed. Before the Voting Rights Act in 1965, there were 72 Black elected officials in the jurisdictions that were covered by the VRA. In 1975, 10 years later, nearly 1,000 Black elected officials. It also changed the way political candidates had to think and act, because now Black people really could exercise their right to vote, and candidates needed Black voters. So it meant that resources and opportunities were directed to Black communities, whereas that had not been happening at all before. So the Voting Rights Act was reenacted a number of times, and was in effect robustly until a challenge came up to the Supreme Court. So this is part of the overall pattern that we have been discussing, is that progress is made, and then a challenge goes to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court overturns the legislation that had achieved justice, equity, or it had been working towards those goals. So it's the year 2013, and the case is Shelby County v. Holder. And at this point in 2013, the Voting Rights Act applied to 9 states and some additional counties. You see them here. They're the ones in the dark red. So it applies to 9 states, including Shelby County, Alabama, and that is the jurisdiction that brought the lawsuit. This is a majority opinion that was written by Chief Justice Roberts, and he strikes down one of the most important parts of the Voting Rights Act, which is the coverage formula. And his logic is that it is based on 40-year-old facts that are not related to what is happening today. So the data that had established which jurisdiction should be covered, he said, well, that's old. It's not relevant to today. If Congress wants to come up with a new formula that is relevant to what is happening now, they can do that. But until then, we're just getting rid of it. So the coverage formula is struck down, which means that there is no more pre-clearance. There are no covered jurisdictions with a history of discrimination. So the requirement to clear any changes in legislation effectively is moot, since there are no covered jurisdictions. So the Supreme Court strikes it down, leaves it in Congress's hands, and we've seen what Congress has failed to do. I also just wanted to highlight for you Justice Ginsburg's dissent, and she summarizes the logic of Justice Roberts as throwing out pre-clearance when it has worked and is continuing to work to stop discriminatory changes is like throwing away your umbrella in a rainstorm because you are not getting wet. So Justice Ginsburg very eloquently is saying it's working and you're throwing it out, and your logic has no basis. So in 2013, the Voting Rights Act effectively is gutted. And what happens next? I will leave to Dwight or Reverend Bailey.
I think the thing too, the 2013 Voter Act, they got cover because Thomas voted for it too, which is it just amazes me that a Black man who was raised in the South, whose grandfather probably was not allowed to vote, would vote to remove the Voting Rights Act. It's just amazing. So he gave the folk cover. That's why when people get upset with me when I talk about, my parents were Republicans, but they changed when Kennedy came in because of the programs he was offering for Black people. So most Black people were Republicans. They changed when the Republican Party left them. And so it's amazing when I still see people who call themselves conservatives, Black folk, and they support stuff like this. Doesn't matter what your politics is. Nobody should support anything like this if they really believe in a justice for all. And Clarence Thomas, the reason why he's not loved in the Black community is just because of that reason, that he's, for us, he just, is something wrong with him to think the way he thinks and to be on the Supreme Court. So we have no representation on the Supreme Court as African Americans, which is sad. Sorry for those of you who like him.
Let me just kind of follow up too, and we'll see this on the next slide. But what this means is, again, thinking historically, we had Reconstruction, we had the federal government providing oversight, voting rights were protected, Black participation went up, Black people were elected, Black people got to participate. We then see this reaction, and we have 60, 70 years where Blacks are denied the right to vote. We then get the Voting Rights Act, And then all of a sudden, Black participation goes up. And we have the Supreme Court who strikes down federal legislation, which the Constitution granted Congress the authority to adopt, strikes it down by 5-4 vote, and allows the states now to go back to adopting laws that suppress the votes of Black people. Now, again, some of these on the face, as Reverend Bailey said before, seem to be fairly benign. Why shouldn't you have to have a voter ID in order to vote, or some type of identification? Why should you be able to register the same day? Just send your registration in advance. You don't need early voting. Everybody else gets to the polls the same day. On and on and on. And one of the things we'll talk about later is these types of restrictions are not designed to suppress the entire Black vote. They're designed to shave off enough votes to keep the Black vote from making a difference. And that's really critical when you begin to look at how our country is set up, the way votes are cast, the way votes are counted in the context of the Electoral College. So do these voter laws that the states adopt directly prohibit Blacks from voting? No. Do they discourage or prevent enough Blacks from voting in order to keep whites in power? Yes. And that's the point. And that's the point. So when you don't have federal oversight and you leave it to the states, certain states are going to use that in order to continue to pursue a strategy of keeping certain communities from voting, at least enough in enough instances that they can stay in power. So if we can go to the next slide, Sheila. We talked about this, and we're seeing it happen again and again and again. When you look at the Shelby County decision, you now have a Supreme Court that strikes down an act of Congress. Folks understand the importance of the Supreme Court. They can strike down laws that are adopted by elected officials. They get to say whether it's constitutional or not. And it's like Justice Ginsburg said, here you had a law that was effective at addressing the history of this country and discriminated against Blacks, and the Supreme Court strikes it down. So you have basically 12 years of Reconstruction, and then you had maybe 45 years of the Voting Rights Act, when Blacks had the opportunity to participate without these types of state laws in place. And we're back to now seeing states, certain states, not all states, attempting to pass these restrictive voting laws. So we can go to the next slide, Sheila. I think this is yours.
Yep. So we just wanted to take a few moments and review some of the specific actions that states are taking now in 2021 in response to the 2020 election. And the key point here is your ability to exercise your right to vote really depends on where you live. So some states are very aggressively enacting laws that restrict the right to vote. In fact, there have been more than 400 bills with provisions that restrict voting access introduced in 49 states in 2021, and we're only in July. So there are a number of different types of laws, but the most common types we are seeing proposed are making mail voting and early voting more difficult. So of course, people who have trouble taking off work on the Tuesday of an election or have other barriers that keep them from the polls are greatly impacted by these. Harsher voter ID requirements, and also purging voter rolls it would become easier in some places. And as Reverend Bailey was saying, these types of restrictions are defended in a somewhat logical way, or attempt at logic, that, you know, why can't you just show a voter ID? It verifies who you are. And those arguments are oftentimes based on racist ideas and on ideas around voter fraud, when there is really no evidence that is actually a problem. So again, the proponents of these bills do their best to leverage seemingly logical and rational arguments when the objective of these types of restrictions is to suppress the vote. So
the other thing they're trying to do too is, if they don't like the vote the way it's happening, they're trying to change the administration of the vote in states so they can change the vote. I mean, come on, what kind of democracy are we living in if we allow people to change the votes because they don't believe that so-and-so candidate lost? It just makes no sense at all to me that people would stand by and be quiet and not say anything, because it's not only going to take away Black votes, that's going to take away a whole lot of folks' votes, and doesn't make any sense. If you don't like the way the vote came out, then you can change it. That's just ridiculous.
To add to that, I think you also hear an argument around states' rights, which is a really common refrain, and to try to defend laws that states enact that are discriminatory and racist. And you have to ask yourself that of any types of laws around the right to vote, if there should be any sort of uniformity and protection, you got to think it's around people's right to vote. But you hear people say over and over, oh, it's the state's right to set up election. And as Dwight covered, in fact, the federal government could exert some oversight. It does default to the states, but the power does reside with the federal government to attempt to make laws in this area.
And Sheila, let me just add, I think, you know, the states' right argument is almost like saying, listen, because the founders, when they adopted the Constitution, wanted to protect the slaveholding states by giving the states rights, certain rights, we should be allowed to continue to do that. I mean, that's the irony of the states' rights argument when it comes to voting, because that type of compromise, granting states the right to regulate a federal election, seems to me it could only relate to protecting the system of slavery that was in place, and being sure that white landowning men at the state level could control who voted, how they voted, when they voted, and whose vote counted. And that's what they were trying to control. So to use that argument, again, state rights argument can be made in other areas with some, I think, convincing logic. But when it comes to voting, for states to be able to regulate how a federal election occurs makes no sense to me.
Right. Particularly in the context of these restrictive laws that we're seeing. So these states highlighted in blue are the ones that have introduced restrictive laws in 2021. And then We also have a great number of states that have introduced legislation that would expand the right to vote. So more than 900 bills have been introduced in 2021 alone in 49 states that would expand the right to vote. And the sort of the common types that you would see are expanding access to early and mail-in voting, making it easier to register, and restoring rights to those who may have felony convictions. So again, your ability to vote depends on the state that you live in.
But why this is so important too is not just for the Black vote. If you can take away one group's vote, who's to say you can't take away other groups? Remember, women have only been allowed to vote for the last 100 years. So who's to say that they can't roll that back? I mean, you can't, I mean, it blows my mind that people stand there and watch like they did in Germany, while certain groups are being taken and not understanding one day they're going to come back for you. So you have to fight for the rights of everyone. Even if you don't agree with how they live, they have rights if they're American citizens. But people sit by quietly and well, they're going after that group. They're not coming after me. And I shut up on this. The January 6th thing, it blew their mind because they never believed that those folk were going to come after them. So nobody's done nothing about that violent group that's been in America for years. Black people have known about them. We've known they're in here in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, in the county. We know where they are. We know who they are. And nobody's done nothing about them because they always thought they were just going to go against certain groups. But what we found on January 6th, they don't care about nobody in America. Nobody. Pence is a white guy, and yet they wanted to go hang him, a Republican, and they wanted to hang him. So you can see the danger that's there, but it's amazing to me, especially when Christians don't see, who say they have so much vision. Shut up, Reverend.
So this slide here is just to give everybody a sense of the importance of what we're talking about. Just a quick refresher. Presidential elections are decided by the Electoral College, not the popular vote. So in 2020, and remember there are 538 votes, Electoral College votes, and the way that those are divvied up is that each state gets one per their senators. So each state gets two, because each state has two senators. And then they get one for the representative, the House of Representative members that they have. Okay, so larger states are going to have more Electoral College votes, but it's not directly proportional to the population because every state gets two because of the senators. So what you can have is and this has occurred now in 3 straight elections that, well, actually not the last election, but the election before, the 2 elections before, you can have a candidate for president get less popular vote and still win the presidency. We all should know that. In 2020, President Biden received 306 Electoral College votes, and former President Trump received 232 votes. President Biden won by almost 7 million in the popular vote. However, a swing of 36 electoral votes would have resulted in Trump winning the presidency. Now let's look at some of the states and the number of votes that separated them. Arizona, Biden won by a little over 10,000 votes. That's 11 Electoral College votes. And remember, almost every state except for Maine and Nebraska, the winner takes all. So there's not a proportional allocation of the Electoral College votes. Georgia, Biden won by a little over 12,000 votes. That's 16. So that's what, 27? Wisconsin, Biden won by 20,000 votes. Those 3 states, that's what, 42,000 votes across 3 states. That would have provided former President Trump the presidency. Just let that sink in. 42,000 votes. And then you add Pennsylvania and Michigan, 81,000 and 154,000. Those are very close margins. So do you see the game that's being played? It's not hard for state legislatures to look at this and understand if we make it just a little more difficult for certain groups to vote, if we don't allow for early voting, if we don't allow for Sunday voting, if we make it harder that somebody has to now go to get an ID, a picture ID, or they have to bring a utility bill, it doesn't take much to make up 10,000 votes. If some of the restrictions that are being adopted now were in place, it's my belief Trump would have won a second term. So even though Biden won by almost 7 million votes, the popular votes, that's not the game that's being played here. They're not trying to get 7 million votes. They're trying to get 42,000 votes. And I think all of us need to understand that. That's why this is so insidious. This is dangerous. This will swing elections. And you're going to continue to see Republican candidates lose the popular vote by significant margins and still have a shot at winning the presidency. And then when you look at some of the special elections in Georgia, those were very, very close. And while you don't have an electoral college for Senate races, you have the same margins that you're dealing with. So in Georgia, if they can knock off 50, 60,000 votes, you are going to now have a different candidate winning. And that's what the point of these election laws are. Like Sheila said, there's no evidence of fraud. Everyone who has looked at the last election has said unequivocally it was the fairest, the best run election in our country's history. So there is only one reason why these are being adopted, and it has nothing to do with fraud. But I think it's important to understand we are talking about small margins, and that's the point. We can go to the next slide, Sheila. So this is just really, it's a quote that we've kind of highlighted, but basically it's saying that these wave of state laws, it's happening in an unprecedented manner. So the combination of the Supreme Court striking down the Voting Rights Act and former President Trump claiming that the election was stolen, creating a lie and a narrative that has taken hold at the state levels, has created all of these state laws that it's going to fundamentally change how and who can vote. Sheila, we can go to the next slide.
So one potential answer to this is a bill that has been proposed called the For the People Act of 2021, and you've probably seen it in the news. It is like a really soaring sort of pie in the sky bill that really is looking to bring voter access to everybody and to address other problems in the way elections are run. So just to cover some of the key provisions of the act, it would have national and automatic voter registration. So basically you would have to opt out of being registered to vote, and it would pull data from existing databases, like from DMVs and other databases that would already have people's information, which would address things like problems when people move and maybe they don't know, they're in the wrong precinct, or their data doesn't get changed over to their new precinct. And so that is a huge piece of this proposed bill. It would be the government's responsibility to keep the information up to date. You would have guaranteed same-day voter registration. Each state would be required to allow at least 15 days of early voting for federal elections for at least 10 hours a day. So again, it really is this like pie in the sky and sweeping proposal. And it would also limit the extent to which states could purge voter rolls. It would address redistricting and gerrymandering, which is another way that that state lawmakers seek to control the vote by drawing very strange and funky lines around different voting districts to be able to weaken and slough off target groups of voters. So instead of the party in power being able to draw the lines around voting districts, it would be a nonpartisan independent commission that would be in charge of redistricting. And it would also require a public comment period. There are proposed changes to campaign finance laws, and that is to address issues that have arisen after the Supreme Court case of Citizens United, where unlimited money can come in from sources that do not have to be identified for campaigns and elections. There would be new ethics rules for public servants, including ethics codes for Supreme Court justices. And there would also be a requirement that a presidential candidate would need to disclose their tax returns. So this is a bill that so far has not gone too far. The Senate wouldn't even debate it. But I think there can be hope that there are, even if this bill does not get passed, and I mean, other people can weigh in, I would feel doubtful that it would, there can be some real positive ideas that come out of the ideas and the different areas that are being addressed in this piece of legislation.
I think one of the things that has to happen, we need to blow the myth of whether the people will have the right to vote in America. I think most people don't know what the Electoral College was started for, was because those who started the Electoral College did not trust the masses to vote the right way. And so even though people talk about voting in America, right from the inception, there was a belief that the majority of people in America should not be able to elect the president of the United States. And that's what the Electoral College was put in place for. And I think most folk don't even know that it was to take away the common man's vote. And it's sad that most people don't know that.
So just a little bit about the filibuster, because as you know, HR 1 was passed by the House of Representatives, and it then went to the Senate, and the Senate has to pass it before it can go to President Biden for his signature. So somebody might say, well, wait a second, we thought the Democrats controlled the Senate. Why can't they pass HR 1, this new voting rights bill, and address all these problems? And the reason is because of the filibuster. The filibuster is an action designed to prolong debate and delay or prevent a vote from ever starting. when a filibuster is enacted, the amount of votes needed to pass the legislation automatically rises from the original majority of 51 to a supermajority of 3/5 or 60 votes, which obviously significantly diminishes the chances that a piece of legislation will be adopted. Now, the filibuster is not based on the Constitution. It's not based on any law. In fact, the history of the filibuster has been traced back to John C. Calhoun, and he used the filibuster and introduced the filibuster to defend Southern slave owners by using the filibusters to derail civil rights legislation. If you step back and just from a big picture perspective, think about this, the absurdity of the filibuster becomes clear. You now have basically given the minority the right to stop the majority that was elected to office from passing legislation. It's like giving the states or the elected officials that want to continue white domination the right to stop legislation from passing, even though they don't have the majority. And in a democracy, that seems just so fundamentally wrong, particularly when you're dealing with voting rights. So this filibuster is a rule that could be changed at any time. And it comes out of the Jim Crow era that was used to prevent civil rights legislation from being passed in order to protect Southern states to maintain a system of discrimination. Does this sound familiar to today? The filibuster is being used to prevent a new federal law that gives access to people to vote. And the reason that's being done is because if more people are given the opportunity to vote, it's going to be a more diverse set of elected officials with more diverse ideas, and it's going to challenge the power structure that's in place. And that is what is so frustrating. We have a moment to adopt a law that would provide standards across the country and open up voting. It's my belief that in a democracy, the best ideas should win, not who can suppress the vote the most. So if you have a good idea, you should get elected to office. And you should allow people to vote freely, unimpeded by laws that are designed to try and shave off enough votes so that not the best ideas win, but candidates that are trying to maintain the status quo. And the status quo in this country is that whites, particularly white men, get to control how the country is run. And there is a challenge to that power structure, and the filibuster allows any of those challenges to basically be killed in the Senate. And that's the struggle we're facing. You can have literally 6, 7, 8 people, 8 senators kill legislation, even though they would not have the votes to otherwise stop it. So the filibuster has become a huge hurdle in moving this country forward with legislation that can address voting rights, and a lot of other justice issues. And until the filibuster is addressed, we're going to have this problem, because unless you get 60 senators that will agree, it's going to be very difficult. And remember, you get 2 senators from every state. So this gives very rural, low population states a huge outsized impact on what happens. If you combine that with the filibuster, you can have South Dakota, North Dakota, Montana. The population is tiny, but think about the outsized impact they have on what legislation can get adopted. It's a real problem. And this seminar was designed to help people understand kind of the issues that are at stake. Sheila, Reverend Bailey, anything else you want to add here?
No, I think what you said, especially there at the end, is it needs to happen. I keep trying to say the focus should not be just on thinking that it's just going to take away the vote from Black people. There's a handful of people who want to run the country, and they will end up running the country. Let them take away this person's vote, that person's vote, and the next thing you know, the elite will be running the country. It's just amazing to me how much argument we have about giving unemployment checks to people. And nobody had a problem giving those large tax breaks to the people who could afford to pay taxes. But nobody argued about that. And if we're not careful, we're going to go right back to being this nation where elites are leading and we're being led by our nose. So it's just not about Black people. It's just not, it's about, I'm an American citizen. And it used to be the Democrats who were against Black folk. That's who it was, the Democrats who were lynching Black folk in the South, stopping Black folk from voting. So I don't have no allegiance to the Democrats or the Republicans, because both of them have turned their back on Black folk when it became opportune for them to do it. But the sad thing is how many other people have lost out because nobody stands up and says, it's not right that people in America should have their vote thrown away. Everybody should be able to vote in America. If you pay your taxes, if you don't pay your taxes, if you're an American citizen, you ought to be able to vote. And that's the way we will get a fair and just government. And I don't think it will be an all Black government that people are afraid of, or an all Puerto Rican government. People are going to vote for those who are fair-minded and people who show that they're for justice. That's who's going to get elected in America.
All right, well, we have a few minutes for some questions. There was one in the chat about, I think, should the Electoral College be abolished? Sheila, what do you think?
I mean, my perspective would be that when the Electoral College prevents the popular vote from prevailing, which is exactly what it's designed to do, and we have seen it do in our history, that doesn't make any sense to me for the election of our president.
Other questions, comments?
We have another question. What would be required to change the filibuster rule?
This is the crazy thing. It's just a majority vote of the senators. They could change it right now. So, again, just following the news, it seems like West Virginia Senator Joe Manchin and potentially Arizona Senator Krista, what's her name? Simica? I'm not sure I'm saying that right. They claim that they're protecting the rights of the minority in Congress to, be involved in legislation, and that it promotes bipartisanship, which is just astonishing to me that is the argument that they would make for preserving the filibuster, because it does the exact opposite. It basically allows the minority to just completely block legislation from being passed. And particularly for voting rights that Congress has the authority embedded in the Constitution to give that right up based on a procedural mechanism makes no sense to me. And so there's talk about an exception to the filibuster rule for voting rights and other civil right type of legislation because of the importance of that kind of legislation and because it relates directly to the Constitution. Any other questions?
All right, Napoleon, is it correct to state that Lancaster County has one ballot drop box for our 50,000 inhabitants? And is that discriminatory?
Well, my understanding was that you could drop your ballot off at the county election office
Right.
in advance if you were going to vote absentee. And but I don't think there were, I might be wrong on this, but were there other locations you could drop your ballot off?
I don't believe so.
Yeah, I think you had to do it in the city at the county Board of Elections.
And that is downtown with limited
Yep.
parking. And certain people can't take time off from work, or they may have a restriction on their time, or have a medical emergency and need to travel. So perhaps Pennsylvania has gotten far ahead of this situation with some restrictions that are, they seem reasonable because another drop box costs some money, but it doesn't cost that much. And it is, in my opinion, rather restrictive to have that one location.
It's just whether you believe that people have the right to vote. If you really want Americans to vote, you would do what they do in other countries. I mean, this is supposed to be a democracy where people should be able to vote, and fewer people vote in America than many other nations. It doesn't make sense.
So what are we going to do about it?
Well, I think that's why we're talking to you folk now. It takes each one of you to say something about it. It takes something for you to call to me and tell them to stop the foolishness, the madness, and spreading the lie about
I've called Mr. Smucker's office repeatedly.
And they call Smucker too. But I think many of us need to call and need to keep calling them and let them know that you're not there because you want to be there. You're there because we voted you in, and we can vote you out. And stop voting along party lines. Like, whatever the party says, we vote. That doesn't make sense.
Well, maybe we should all call Joe Manchin's office.
Yeah.
I mean, it's very frustrating to see that it would just take a simple majority and you could fix this. I mean, we are so close. And think about it. If states are allowed to change the way federal elections are handled at the state level, then this very bare minimal majority will be lost, and you will not have this opportunity for potentially decades. Think about that. So you have this catch-22. You have to fix the voting rights problems with states enacting state laws. But in order to do that, you got to change the filibuster, and the majority Democrats won't change it.
Would it be
It's
easier
crazy.
to work on gerrymandering than on the filibuster laws? I don't know. I'm not a politician.
Well, in Pennsylvania, gerrymandering is illegal under the state constitution. So that's not an issue in Pennsylvania anymore. But in other states, sure, that's my personal opinion is if we could get national standards that allow people to easily vote, early voting, mail-in voting, drop boxes, put some of these other issues aside, just get a basic set of standards that allow people to vote. I think that's easier to get through. HR 1, like Sheila said, has everything in it. And I just don't see that passing. If you get a focused bill that prevents states from putting in these restrictive laws, to me, that's a huge victory.
Bree, how do we make it happen?
Well, there's still a chance. I read in the news today that the Senate, the Democrats in the Senate are looking at a pared down voting rights bill. And, it literally comes down to one senator. I think you have enough of the Democrats that will change the filibuster rule that if you can convince one or two more, at least for voting rights, it still could get through. But I mean, who knows? I don't know. I mean, how do you convince a senator from West Virginia who doesn't want to change a rule that's been in place for decades to protect southern states? It's frustrating. Other questions, comments? Well, I see we have reached our time. Reverend Bailey and Sheila, always a pleasure.
Yeah.
And
Wait, I don't know if you noticed, I posted Joe Manchin's office phone number for you. I put it in the chat.
oh no, I didn't notice that.
202-224-3954. That's something we can all do tomorrow.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Lynn. Thank you all for attending. Everybody hung in there for an hour and a half. I hope you have a great rest of your day and a good rest of the summer, and we'll see you back in August and then the rest of this year. Thanks for coming.
Thank you.
See ya.
Thanks all. Bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good night.
Great job.
Good night.
Good night, John boy.
Good night, River.